So my first question is, why did this project become the project that you needed to do now?
Well, this is a film that I've been working on for quite a while. I've made a handful of shorts that are related thematically. Mm-hmm. Not a direct proof of content short.
Yeah.
But making shorts that build a world of teenagers and adults in small towns in the United States where everyone is making life-changing mistakes. And in the shorts, oftentimes those we're not sure where the mistakes will lead. This is the short form; it's much more open. Mm-hmm. But I wanted to make a feature that required some sort of satisfying arcs, satisfying ending to this very weird, dark world that I created. Mm-hmm. So I'm not replicating the characters of the shorts or the world of the shorts, but there's this very clear kind of trajectory. And I don't consider myself, as a human, I feel deeply politically engaged in the world, in politics and in social justice issues. The way that my film deals with maybe social issues is perhaps more subtle. So in this film also, right now it felt like I was just happening to be writing it, and now, for instance, in post-production, during the Kavanaugh hearings in the U.S.,
yes,
it had everything to do with the lives of teenage girls with boys and adult men who don't respect or understand boundaries.
Yes.
So it also just felt like
the timing was
right.
Okay.
But in one of the relationships in the film, the relationship between the teen girl and the substitute teacher, that's directly autobiographical from my own life. And so there was something that I was in high school many years ago, but I also wanted to, it's kind of heartbreaking to understand that for a very, very long time that teenage girls have had to sort of literally fight their way out of adolescence.
Do we find some of that tone or style or stylistic voice in your previous features?
Yeah, almost directly, in two in specific. So a short film that's called A Million Miles Away, and another short film that's called Blood Below the Skin. Those films are related to each other, but they are also directly related to this. It's as though the children had the mother in this regard. I mean, I literally recreated scenes from those films. So in this new feature length, there's a scene where a girl is helping do alterations for another girl on a very lacy pink kind of homecoming dance dress, and that is a scene directly from Blood Below the Skin. That I thought, worked well in that context. It's a film that I really loved shooting the first time. I loved kind of tweaking or revising some of the dialogue, obviously recasting the whole thing, different pink dress, blah, blah, blah. But with short films, especially in the US, what is that audience? I've made these short films where I have no sense that the average teenager, whether they're in the States or otherwise, are like trolling around on the internet for short, experimental, feminist films.
Yeah. Yeah.
So they have a limited audience. So I sort of felt like borrowing some little bits of dialogue, borrowing some relationships. None of the songs are the same, but A Million Miles Away also has a scene where a girl's choir is singing and the teacher has a breakdown.
Okay.
It's very different, but
okay.
They're related.
Okay.
But it sort of felt like kind of borrowing my own material and absorbing it into the kind of mothership, made sense because people see the mothership. They don't always see this little sort of satellites. Maybe they'll retroactively go back and watch how it's all related to my previous work.
What are some of the non-film references that influence your approach when creating the visual aesthetic for this film?
So myself and my DP and the gaffer looked at the photography of Gregory Crutzen, which I think is probably a relatively common cinematic reference. We also looked at the photography of Todd Hito, who also uses light and windows and colored light in a really very particular way, or sort of atmospheric foggy stuff. But we for the
it's mostly a nocturnal world.
Correct. Yeah, and both of those guys shoot a lot at night with these either an unseen kind of light source, or a sort of a house with a window kind of glowing in the background that's kind of glowing the wrong color. So or maybe they're not the most realistic color. So there's a scene where the garage door opens up of a house and the light in the garage is bright red, and does that seem like a normal color for the garage light? Perhaps not, but it's not. But what we wanted for that scene was a heightened level of sort of trauma for it to sort of hover above reality slightly. So we looked at those photographers. We looked at stills from Robbie Mueller, who, he's a cinematographer who passed away right before we started shooting. But something like the way that he was using light in Paris, Texas, for instance, among many others, was really beautiful. But we also looked at for the wounds. There's some wounded people. Yeah. We looked at the painter Jenny Saville, who does these beautiful sort of very abstract, kind of squishy, melting bodies. So we actually looked at painting and photography.
Okay. Yeah, film like this. I was wondering, at what stage did setting, place, location, backdrop? How did that help the creative process, either prior to writing the screenplay or perhaps afterwards when finding locations? Like, how did that enhance mood?
So I always knew. I grew up in Ohio. I live right now in the northwest tip of Indiana, basically right outside Chicago, all Midwest. I consider myself and my films Midwestern. That can be either for some people a giant concept or something that seems extremely narrow and uninteresting. I think of it as the former. I think that being sort of like in the middle of the country, where it's actually deeply flat. Literally, it's like the flatness of the landscape or the vastness of big rivers and lakes kind of takes over, sort of dwarfs the subject. So, and there's also that kind of hardy work ethic of the Midwest, which trickles into even the mistake making. So I think that Midwesterners, when they make a mistake, they really go for it. They really mess it hard. So I honestly, that it was in my brain when I was writing it. It was always taking place in some place that was outside of a city. Most likely someplace in the Midwest. At one point early on, there was a producer who lived in Louisville, Kentucky, and he's like, we should shoot it in Kentucky, which seems super interesting to me. So then I was doing lots of research about Kentucky and thinking of it as more of a Southern Gothic story rather than a Midwestern Gothic story, which is sometimes how I describe it. But then the more that I sort of did my research, I thought it would be, for still like an indie low budget, I thought, why am I trying to shoot someplace that I don't know at all? So then there was a moment where I was going to shoot in my hometown, or sort of outside of my hometown in Central Ohio. But Central Ohio doesn't have such a great infrastructure for feature filmmaking. There's not equipment, there's not crew, there's nobody who knows how to cater a 25-day shoot, etc. So I brought it back to outside of Chicago. So we shot it in rural Illinois. We shot like 30 minutes south of Chicago, in a small town called Lamont, which is so perfectly the exact setting. Is
there a timelessness about Lamont?
Yeah, there is, because it's like It's, I mean, it really is one of those towns the time sort of forgot. It reminds me a lot of where I live right now in Northwest Indiana.
Okay.
They're both refinery towns. They were both kind of these union towns. They both have rivers that run through it. They both have quarries. And they both at some point, because of maybe that sort of industry history and literally the refinery history, which is this, you know, it's just like at night, right? The refinery. I mean, it's horrible for the environment, but my God, it's so cinematic. So at some point, all these jobs were coming into these small towns, and then those jobs sort of stopped expanding, and so people are still kind of stuck there in this sort of sad way.
It's a less traumatic Detroit, perhaps.
That's right, exactly. And it had, and I love the landscape of these, like making a kind of a teen horror, or nodding at the teen horror, where you must have water. You know, you must have the potential for someone to have disappeared in the water, or to wash up on the shores of the water, something like this. But the quarry in Lamont in particular that just felt like it had a lot of sort of pathos. You know, the sort of like, what is a quarry? So when I knew that we were going to shoot there, when we locked down that sort of area as that location, you know, it actually, you know, some of the dialogue changed, and some of the, some of the other sort of moments, the really crucial moments that kind of set the whole story in motion changed. But I was really happy. It was like we sort of found each other.
Great.
I don't necessarily. I spent enough time in Lamont now for a little while. I don't need to go back necessarily, but it was great shooting there, because it's like those things inform each other. And the same thing with casting. When I knew that we had the cast was finalized, you know, there were some things that changed, because when you're writing it, you just have these. They're very
prototypes.
Right. So then when we cast it, you know, there were some things that changed. Some more subtly than others, but it was in flux almost until like 48 hours before the first day of production.
Wow. Okay. And like on set as a director, like this film, it's I would almost say it's a rather large ensemble. There's a lot of.
So this is sort of the first time that I've cast teenagers who were a little older than 14, literally. And who had a lot of already theater experience, film experience, and television experience. So prior to this, I would cast a 14-year-old to play a 14-year-old, which on camera, amazing. Terrible skin, weird teeth, you know. I say that with so much love, you know. But we knew that we needed to have longer days. You know, we couldn't sort of deal with a 14-year-old on set necessarily. And the parts were nuanced in a way that I needed consistent performances. I needed someone who I knew was directable, you know, that I wouldn't have to sort of struggle to direct. So our teenagers, all of whom were already like 18, 19, 20, none of them were 25 or something like this. So they're not sort of that far out of high school, but already very accomplished. So it didn't. On the one hand, there wasn't a moment where it was like pulling teeth to get a good performance. But a lot of what I wanted to do with the teenagers or the people who are acting as teenagers, or those performances, was to make it err on the side of deadpan, as opposed to sort of a kind of a valley girl, like, oh my God, I love that dress so much, you know? Because it's not their coming of age story. It's the adults who are having a coming of age. The teenagers are simply experiencing their life. Nothing that's happening to them is unremarkable, because it's all so fucked up. Just every moment, you know? So I wanted them to err on the side of deadpan performances, as though, why should I get excited? Why should I get worked up about what's happening to me? This is what happens to me every day, and it's what happened to me yesterday, and it's what will happen to me tomorrow. So it was easy to do that, you know, when someone was like, their performance was a little too, you know, up and too much kind of like smiling faces, or like, you know, I was like, no, let's do that again. Just go more sort of like deadpan, and so. And they would understand that, you know, that was good, because their personalities are also quite different from who they actually are. So there's this young man who plays, just this terribly misguided, teenage boy. And I think he was so sort of mortified at his own character, because in real life, of course, he's this like really lovely, feminist guy.
Yes.
But he could turn on the douche, but then sometimes that was a little bit sort of like, no, you have to go for it. It has to be worse than that. You have to cry now, and so it wasn't difficult to direct them, but it was definitely directing them to err on the side of deadpan. So we knew that what they were experiencing was unremarkable to them, and that so that in contrast to the parents who were really unraveling.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.